Bodybuilding has always had its heroes, but no rivalry ever hit harder than Arnold Schwarzenegger versus Mike Mentzer. On one side, the charm, the confident grin, and the magnetic presence of a man who seemed unbeatable. On the other, the analytical mind, almost philosophical discipline, and cold stare of someone who wanted to turn the sport into science. Two giants with completely opposite visions, about to collide in a showdown that would change bodybuilding forever. Arnold was more than an athlete. He was a phenomenon. The moment he stepped on stage, he owned the room before even hitting his first pose. He didn't just show muscles. He showed confidence, humor, and an infectious energy that lit up everyone around him. He was the perfect showman, the kind of competitor who didn't need to say a word for everyone to know he'd already won before the judges even spoke. For millions of fans, Arnold was bodybuilding itself. Mike Mentzer, on the other hand, was his complete opposite. While Arnold won crowds over with charisma, Mike relied on silence and logic. He viewed the body as a machine, one that responded to reason, not emotion. His theories challenged decades of traditional training, and his serious, focused demeanor made it clear he wasn't there just to compete. He was there to prove a point. Deep down, Mike didn't just want to beat Arnold. He wanted to prove that intellect could defeat legend. But what happens when the king is challenged by someone who refuses to bow to the crown? That was the question hanging over the bodybuilding world in the late 1970s. Arnold, the ultimate symbol of glory, and Mike, the man who dared to question the system, were heading toward a clash that would be remembered for generations. And the chosen battleground couldn't be more iconic. The 1980 Mr. Olympia, the event that would mark the dawn of a new era. Their rivalry wasn't just about muscles. It was about ideology. Each represented a completely different way of thinking, living, and understanding the human body. Arnold was the artist who turned muscle into performance. Mike was the philosopher who turned training into science. When Arnold Schwarzenegger walked onto the Mr. Olympia stage in 1970, bodybuilding witnessed the birth of a legend. At just 23 years old, he wasn't just younger than most veterans. He was bigger, bolder, and far more charismatic than anyone else. The audience didn't just see an impressive physique, they saw a man clearly destined for greatness. The trophy was merely the beginning of an era. From 1970 to 1975, Arnold ruled without question. No one came close to threatening his throne. Every victory reinforced his image as an athlete above the rest, someone who commanded the stage as effortlessly as he breathed. His muscles were massive, but his true weapon was his mind. Arnold understood that bodybuilding wasn't just about lifting weights. It was about telling a story through the body. And he told the best story of all. During those 6 straight wins, Arnold mastered the art of psychological warfare. Before competitions, he'd joke around, throw subtle jabs, and plant seeds of doubt in his rivals' minds. Bodybuilding is a mental game, he used to say, and no one played it better. On stage, his confident smile made others crumble. That mix of strength and intellect made him more than a champion. It made him a symbol of total dominance. But in 1975, after claiming his 6th consecutive title, Arnold shocked the world by announcing his retirement. He'd beaten every opponent, broken every record, and, most importantly, set a standard almost impossible to reach. His focus now shifted toward a new dream, conquering Hollywood. The man who had already ruled the bodybuilding stage was now ready to rule the big screen. That next chapter began in 1977 with Pumping Iron. The documentary, which followed his final competition, showcased not just his training, but also his charisma and sharp wit. Audiences fell in love with the confident, funny Austrian. Suddenly, bodybuilding wasn't just a niche sport anymore, it was pop culture. Gyms filled up around the world, and lifting weights became synonymous with health, success, and aspiration. Arnold had done the impossible. He turned an obscure sport into a global phenomenon. From athlete to icon, from champion to myth. His face was on every magazine cover. His physique inspired generations. And his story proved that true strength only matters when it's guided by vision and purpose. In the 1970s, Arnold wasn't just the king of bodybuilding. He was the very definition of the perfect champion. While Arnold Schwarzenegger was charming the world with charisma and muscle, Mike Mentzer was walking a completely different path, the path of reason. Born in Pennsylvania in 1951, Mike was more fascinated by philosophy than sports. While most kids dreamed of holding trophies, he dreamed of understanding how the human body really worked. His biggest inspiration was Ayn Rand, the writer and founder of Objectivism. She taught that logic and rationality should guide every action, and Mike decided to apply that philosophy directly to bodybuilding. Alongside his brother Ray Mentzer, Mike began turning training into a true scientific experiment. They questioned everything: sets, reps, rest periods, even the sacred training methods that no one dared to challenge. For Mike, because that's how it's always been done, wasn't an acceptable answer. Every exercise needed a logical reason. Every result needed concrete proof. Together, the brothers developed a new training philosophy, a revolution that soon got a name: heavy duty. Heavy duty was simple to understand, but radical for its time. While most athletes spent 3 or 4 hours a day in the gym doing 20 or 30 sets per muscle group, Mike thought that was a complete waste. For him, the secret wasn't doing more, but doing better. Training beyond what's necessary, he said, was like trying to fill a glass that's already full. The body needed intensity, not volume. That idea directly challenged the traditional philosophy Arnold represented, and it would soon put Mike on a collision course with the king of bodybuilding himself. In the heavy-duty system, every set was taken to the absolute limit of muscular failure. That meant training until the body literally couldn't move the weight anymore. Fewer sets, but each executed with perfection and total effort. According to Mike, muscle growth happened during rest, not during the workout. That's why shorter, more intense sessions followed by proper recovery were the ideal formula. Science was finally starting to challenge the myth. In 1978, the world finally understood what Mike had been trying to prove. At that year's Mr. Universe, he achieved something unprecedented: a perfect score. Every judge gave him the maximum rating, a feat no one had ever accomplished before. The message was clear: the method worked. Heavy duty wasn't just theory, it was visible, measurable, undeniable proof. Mike Mentzer had shown that efficiency could beat volume, and that intellect could outshine tradition. But as his ideas gained traction, Mike started to make waves, and not always in a good way. His logical, no-nonsense personality clashed with the glamour and brotherhood that defined bodybuilding culture back then. He didn't crack jokes, didn't smile on stage, and refused to accept dogma without questioning it. To some, he was arrogant. To others, a visionary. But one thing was certain: the man who dared to challenge Arnold Schwarzenegger was about to face not just a rival, but an entire system. And that battle would change the sport forever. The year was 1980, and everything pointed to it being Mike Mentzer's big moment. He had refined his heavy-duty method to perfection, built an incredible physique, and earned the respect of athletes and fans who saw him as the future of bodybuilding. For Mike, that year's Mr. Olympia, held in Sydney, Australia, wasn't just another contest. It was the culmination of a philosophy. The stage was set to crown logic and science as the new forces of the sport. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. Just 24 hours before the competition, a bombshell dropped. Arnold Schwarzenegger was back. After 5 years of retirement, the former king announced, without warning, that he'd compete again. None of the other athletes had time to prepare for the return of a legend. The decision felt like an abuse of power, and to Mike Mentzer, it was the ultimate symbol of injustice. In his mind, the system had just chosen its winner before the show even began. Backstage, the atmosphere turned electric and tense. Arnold's return split the room between those who revered him and those who felt betrayed by the favoritism. Mike saw it all as political manipulation, proof that the sport had become more about popularity than performance. And while Mike stayed composed and serious, Arnold did the opposite, cracking jokes, teasing, and using his trademark charisma to dominate the room. It was like pumping iron all over again. Only this time, everyone else was part of his supporting cast. During a pre-contest athletes meeting, tensions finally boiled over. Witnesses said Arnold and Mike nearly came to blows, separated only by other competitors before things got physical. The air was thick with hostility. Respect had vanished, replaced by anger and distrust. What had started as a simple sports rivalry had now become something far more personal, a full-blown war. In the days leading up to the event, the tension was impossible to hide. Arnold looked confident, acting as if the title was already his. Mike, on the other hand, saw the whole thing as a performance, a setup designed to make sure the people's champion would win again. Every glance between them carried years of philosophy, pride, and pent-up rivalry. The war between instinct and reason was about to explode for the whole world to see. When the lights came on and the crowd started filling the arena, no one realized they were about to witness the most controversial moment in bodybuilding history. Arnold's sudden comeback had turned Mr. Olympia into a battlefield, and on that stage stood not just sculpted physiques, but clashing ideologies. On one side, the old guard of showmanship and influence. On the other, a new era driven by logic and merit. The confrontation was about to begin, and its consequences would shake the sport forever. The big day finally arrived. The 1980 Mr. Olympia promised to be one of the greatest competitions ever, with 16 athletes ready to fight for bodybuilding's most coveted title. But even before the show began, suspicion filled the air. 15 competitors signed a petition to merge the weight divisions, hoping to make the contest fairer and more transparent. Only one man refused to sign, Arnold Schwarzenegger. That simple act deepened the unease, convincing many that something wasn't right, that maybe the outcome had already been decided. Backstage, rumors spread like wildfire. Many athletes believed Arnold's sudden return wasn't a coincidence, but part of a plan. They whispered that his influence and close ties with the organizers could guarantee him the trophy no matter what happened on stage. The usual camaraderie among competitors turned into a minefield of wary glances and hushed conversations. Mike Mentzer, Frank Zane, Chris Dickerson, and Boyer Coe all knew they were in top shape, but they also knew they were fighting against more than just another bodybuilder. When Arnold finally stepped under the lights, the crowd noticed something surprising. He wasn't in peak condition. His legs looked smaller, his midsection less tight, and the razor-sharp definition that once made him untouchable was gone. But the charisma, that was still there. Every smile, every pose, every look from the Austrian legend still hypnotized the audience. It was as if the myth itself had returned, even if the physique wasn't quite the same. Meanwhile, his competitors looked incredible. Frank Zane, last year's champion, appeared symmetrical and refined. Chris Dickerson displayed flawless proportions and one of the most polished routines of his career. And Mike Mentzer, with his thick, powerful build, looked ready to claim the throne. To the crowd, the difference was obvious. These men represented the future, while Arnold felt like a memory from the past. Still, the legend was back, and no one knew what that truly meant until the judging began. As the rounds went on, the unthinkable happened. The favorites began dropping one by one. Zane was placed outside the top two. Mentzer didn't even make the top three. When the final announcement came, the entire arena held its breath. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the new Mr. Olympia. The reaction was instant. Boos erupted from the crowd. Competitors walked off stage in protest, and even a few judges looked shocked. It felt like the credibility of the entire sport had collapsed in a matter of seconds. That night became a turning point. For many, it wasn't just an unfair decision. It was a blow to the soul of bodybuilding. For the first time, fans openly questioned whether Olympia titles were truly earned through physique or handed out to the biggest name. Mike Mentzer and several others stormed off the stage in anger, vowing never to compete again. What should have been a celebration of human potential turned into a symbol of manipulation and favoritism. And the bodybuilding world would never be the same after that night in Sydney. The fallout from the 1980 Mr. Olympia hit the sport like an earthquake. What was supposed to be a showcase of physical excellence became a scandal that split bodybuilding in two. On one side were those who defended Arnold, saying his presence elevated the event. On the other, a massive wave of athletes and fans who saw the victory as blatant injustice. The credibility bodybuilding had built over the years seemed to crumble right before the audience's eyes. Among the greats, frustration was written all over their faces. Frank Zane, three-time Mr. Olympia and the embodiment of classic aesthetics, vowed never to return to competition. His silence spoke louder than any speech, a quiet protest against what he saw as a corrupted system. Mike Mentzer, however, was even more direct. Fueled by anger and disappointment, he walked away from the stage for good. To him, bodybuilding had stopped being a fair competition and turned into a show controlled from behind the curtain. Outside the arenas, the fallout was devastating. Magazines, columnists, and sponsors suddenly found themselves caught in a storm. Some publications, especially those aligned with the IFBB and Arnold, tried to smooth things over, celebrating the return of the king. Others, however, openly called out the favoritism, publishing angry letters from fans and athletes. The public, which once saw bodybuilding as an art form, began to see it as a game of influence, a stage where a name weighed more than a physique. That crisis of trust shook the very foundation of the sport. Promoters began losing sponsors, TV coverage was canceled, and fan interest plummeted. For the first time, conversations weren't about muscle mass, symmetry, or conditioning. They were about politics and manipulation. Mr. Olympia, once the symbol of athletic excellence, became a reminder of disappointment and disillusionment. Under growing pressure, the IFBB had no choice but to act. In the years that followed, the federation overhauled its judging system, seeking greater transparency and fairness. It started emphasizing objective criteria like symmetry, proportion, and conditioning, trying to remove the influence of fame and favoritism. It was an important step, but not enough to erase the damage. The public remained skeptical, and many athletes never returned to the stage. Even with these reforms, the scar remained. The 1980 Mr. Olympia became synonymous with manipulation and bias, an eternal wound in bodybuilding history. That night didn't just crown a champion, it destroyed an era of trust. What had once been celebrated as the sport of discipline and self-overcoming now lived under a cloud of doubt. What truly defines a winner, the physique or the power behind the scenes? After the 1980 scandal, many competitors tried to move on. Some returned to competition, others quietly stepped away, leaving the stage and the controversy behind. But Mike Mentzer wasn't the kind of man to forget. To him, that event wasn't just a loss, it was a wound that never healed. While the world celebrated Arnold's comeback, Mike saw only the death of integrity in bodybuilding. And unlike most, he refused to stay silent. In the decades that followed, Mentzer became a controversial but necessary voice. Through interviews, lectures, and articles, he condemned what he saw as a system poisoned by politics and favoritism. He called the 1980 Olympia the turning point of corruption in the sport. According to him, Arnold's victory wasn't earned on stage, it was arranged behind closed doors. His tone wasn't bitter for bitterness's sake, it was a crusade for fairness, an effort to restore what bodybuilding once stood for: honesty. One of his most famous quotes echoed across the bodybuilding world: "Only the 7 judges and their friends thought Arnold won." With that line, Mentzer summed up the frustration of thousands of fans and athletes. To him, the real issue wasn't just who won. It was the system that allowed subjective and easily manipulated decisions. As long as judging is based on opinion, he said, bodybuilding will never be a fair sport. It was a direct shot at the IFBB and a condemnation of how spectacle had overshadowed meritocracy. Mike often compared bodybuilding to sports like gymnastics and diving, disciplines that also relied on judges, yet followed standardized technical criteria. He argued that bodybuilding needed the same: objective scoring, transparency, and universal rules. Only then, he believed, could the sport regain its lost respect and become a true competition between athletes, not between reputations. Over time, Mentzer stepped away from competition, but never from critical thinking. He continued to teach his heavy-duty method, writing books, and giving seminars around the world. He became more than a former champion. He became bodybuilding's philosopher. His ideas inspired generations, from beginners to pros who wanted to train with logic, efficiency, and purpose. Even without recent titles, his voice remained that of a revolutionary who never backed down. When Mike Mentzer passed away in 2001, bodybuilding lost one of its greatest thinkers, and perhaps its most loyal critic. Until the end, he held firm to his conviction: Arnold didn't deserve that title, and the 1980 Olympia had tainted the sport he loved. Yet, paradoxically, that unwavering stance made him a legend. Mike Mentzer wasn't just the man who challenged Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was the man who dared to challenge the entire system. And that, perhaps, was his greatest legacy. The 1980 Mr. Olympia was far more than just a bodybuilding competition. It was a cultural rupture, a turning point that split the sport into before and after. That night in Sydney exposed something fans didn't want to believe, that even the most perfect physique could lose to the power of influence. What began as a showdown between two athletes became a mirror reflecting the sport's deepest tensions: merit versus politics, reason versus spectacle. The consequences came fast. The departure of major names like Frank Zane, Mike Mentzer, and others made room for a new generation of champions in the 1980s. But at the same time, the sport lost a part of its soul. Public trust was shaken, and bodybuilding began to be viewed with suspicion. Many fans started wondering if it was still worth admiring a sport where the best physique didn't always win. Passion gave way to doubt, a wound that would take years to heal. Even today, whenever a controversial decision happens, the name Mr. Olympia 1980 comes back into conversation. A bitter reminder that fairness in bodybuilding isn't always visible to the naked eye. The clash between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mike Mentzer became an eternal symbol: charisma versus logic, the idol versus the idealist, tradition versus revolution. It was the collision of two worlds, not just two physiques, but two completely different philosophies of life. What's ironic is that, unintentionally, both men helped shape the future of the sport. Arnold, through his fame and influence, opened doors that made bodybuilding a global phenomenon. Mike, through his scientific and critical mindset, inspired a generation to pursue truth and transparency. One without the other, bodybuilding might never have evolved the way it did. They were rivals, yes, but also, in a strange way, complementary. Strength and reason, standing on opposite sides of the same stage. In the end, the 1980 Olympia wasn't remembered just for a controversial trophy, but for what it represented. It was the night politics triumphed over perfection, but also the night bodybuilding was forced to look in the mirror and change. And that's how one of the most intense and controversial stories in bodybuilding history comes to an end. A duel not just between two men, but between two worldviews. On one side, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the embodiment of ambition and charisma who carried the sport to stardom. On the other, Mike Mentzer, the thinker who challenged the system and fought for fairness when everyone else stayed silent. Two giants who, in opposite ways, left marks that time could never erase. But now I've got to ask, whose side are you on? Do you believe Arnold truly deserved that win? Or do you think Mentzer was right, that the sport's integrity was lost that night? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your take, because it's this kind of debate that keeps the passion for this incredible sport alive. If you enjoyed this deep dive into bodybuilding history, hit the like button. It really helps the channel keep bringing you powerful, story-driven content like this. And if you want to support our work even more, consider becoming a member. Oh, and of course, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next videos. We're preparing legendary stories, champion breakdowns, and rare backstage moments you won't find anywhere else. And before you go, don't click away just yet. Right here on the side, there's another video you need to watch. In it, we reveal the behind the scenes of another defining moment in bodybuilding, one that, just like this story, changed the sport forever. Go ahead, click it, stay with us, and let's keep reliving the eras that shaped the giants of bodybuilding.